Okay, I am recording,
Okay,
so give us a clap.
there we go. All
Hey,
right. Well, it's always fun. Technology.
yeah. Well, I think so I was just listening to it, and it sounds good
Okay.
on my end now. So I think we're good. But what we can do too, I think, is just like maybe for the first couple ones, record like a standard greeting later, like our
Yeah.
standard intro, and just be like, "You're listening to, the John Waters prison experiment," or um,
Whatever we end up calling
right. But okay.
it.
So
Okay.
topic one, I think is it's appropriate for like, a first initial one, but what does it mean to be a writer? And I know
Yeah.
you've got some thoughts on that. So let's let's just hear your take on it. What does it mean to Neil Christiansen to be a writer?
You know what? I kind of had that whole issue kind of opened up and changed a little bit last night. I was talking with my partner. We were sitting and drinking bourbon last night and
Mm-hmm.
and had several servings, and we were talking about today's show, and we were talking about what it means to be a writer, and she had some really interesting things that she was bringing up, because what it means to be a writer depends a lot on where you're coming from, right? So I've
Mm-hmm.
always said that what it means to be a writer is just, if you're writing, you know if you're if you sit down every day and write, even if it's not every day, say it's every other day, say it's once a week, if you're sitting down and writing, whether you're published or not, you're a writer. And she said, well, what if you write in a diary every day? What if you don't think of yourself as a storyteller, but
Mm-hmm.
you're writing in a diary? Does that make you a writer? And I thought, well, that makes it an interesting question, because if you're not identifying as a writer, if that's not something that you are looking for, then maybe it doesn't make you a writer just because you're actually writing something every day. And so I said, well, maybe it's if you're telling a story, and it could be fictional or non-fictional, but if you're a storyteller, then you're a writer. And it also depends on geography. If you live in LA and you say I'm a writer, it means you're writing TV or movies, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Probably. If you live in New York, then you're probably a novelist, if you're or maybe a poet. And so what does it mean to be a writer? And is writing actually the thing that then makes you a writer? And so we started having this conversation about the difference between being a writer and being a storyteller, and then a little bit about like publishing. Like, if you're not sharing your work, if you don't intend to share your work, if your work is something you do for yourself, and it's not meant to be shared broadly with other people, you know is that being a writer, or is that just kind of a self-indulgent thing? And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but is that kind of just a self-indulgent thing that you're doing for yourself, and it doesn't, and even if you're writing stories, is that being a writer if you're not sharing the work?
Mm-hmm.
you know and so we dove into this like really deep dive of, like, we started talking about the origins of writing, and back, when writing was hieroglyphics, and even before that, and where did writing start? And I tried to look it up this morning and I couldn't find it, but my recollection is that our first recorded instances of people writing things down, of writing on clay tablets, or whatever it is not storytelling. It's things like grocery lists, or
Mm-hmm.
supplies, or instructions. And so the more we talked, the more I thought that this topic of what it means to be a writer is a lot bigger than just whether or not you. So what are your thoughts? Like, let's see where you stand, and we can kind of maybe have a dialogue about that.
Well, I think, the very first thing on my list when I was jotting down topics was self-identification, like whether somebody just says they're a writer. But I think, you kind of brought up doing it, as a self-indulgent thing, being more of a hobby, I guess. To somebody who just writes for themselves because they purely love it, does that, give them access to that name? And I think it has to do with partly with the way that that we define ourselves. So my wife is a teacher, right? So she will say when you're talking about her occupation, she's a teacher, but like nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody, but like you don't have the same kind of status, I guess, associated with being a teacher as people place on being a writer, right? So there's this hesitation to say, "Oh, I'm a writer," because people don't feel like they're qualified yet to say that. And so there's more weight to that label, whereas my wife doesn't blink an eye at saying, "Oh yeah, no, I'm a teacher," right? Like that's just something that she does. So I think that there's more weight to being a writer because it has a different level of cultural meaning to it. Like, it's not just an occupation, it's not just an identity, but it's something like that we kind of hesitate to, give ourselves permission to label ourselves as. And I think just the fact that we have this, on our list shows that it's different than a lot of things. Like, when I because I write professionally, I'm a technical writer, so I could say I'm a writer, but I don't. I say I'm a technical writer. And, so what makes that difference? And for me, it's the storytelling part of it. That's if I were to tell somebody, if I published and then I was, saying to somebody I'm a writer, I would be saying that I'm a storyteller. I write fiction or I write nonfiction, but I write in an arena where people read it for pleasure. They read it, maybe, on their own time. Like I play guitar, right? I guess, but I don't call myself a musician,
Well, I
so
think that
maybe it's,
that's I
yeah,
think
maybe
that's
it's
an
an arts
interesting
thing.
point. No, I think that's an interesting point because going back to your wife, she's a teacher and she doesn't hesitate to call herself a teacher, but that's how she makes her living. And I think that in just speaking from American society, I think that we identify ourselves by what we do to make money as our primary identity. So your wife, if she wasn't working at a school, if she didn't, go and get a degree in education, if every day she went to the park and sat on a bench and, kids would come up and she would show them something in nature and tell them, about it and educate them, she wouldn't then go to a party and say, I'm a teacher. Even
Mhm.
though maybe she is, maybe that's, what she does with her life is she goes out and teaches people, but it's not what she does to pay the rent. And therefore she wouldn't feel comfortable calling herself a teacher. The same way, even though you can play guitar and you probably have even, strummed a few things before that, you made up on your own, you don't call yourself a musician. And I think that that's potentially a hazardous road to go down. I mean, I do not pay my electric bill with my writing. I work in event technology. I produce events. But if you ask me to self-identify, I will self-identify as a writer before I'll self-identify in that capacity because I feel like it contributes to, for lack of a better term, my soul, my who it is to be, what it is to be Neil is storytelling and writing and language. And so that's how I self-identify. But I do agree that a lot of people struggle with that. They say, well, I'm not, you know I didn't buy groceries this week with the money I made writing
Mhm.
something, and therefore I'm not really a writer. And I think that that is I find that to be a precarious thing for lots of things, but most of all, like self-esteem.
Mhm.
If what you want to be as a writer and you put in the work and you write every day, but you're not published yet, or your story's not done yet, or you're published but you're not making enough money to live off of, which, by the way, is the majority of professional writers,
Right.
including those that are published traditionally. The majority of people who write the books that you go to Barnes and Noble and buy a book in a bookstore have quote unquote day job. It's
Mhm.
only like the top tier of writers with these, huge contracts that can make an absolute living off of it. And so I think identifying a writer as someone who makes their living writing stories is not the right thing to do. On the other hand, I don't think anymore, at least, that just writing on paper or on your computer every day necessarily makes you a writer unless you want it to. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'm with you on that. I mean, because I think, my point is more to kind of what you said was like, being an American, how much we identify with our jobs. And I'm with you where I think that, what how we identify, and if we say we're a writer, like I think that first of all, how you frame it, is going to determine, I think, to some degree, your success in it. If you don't think of yourself as a writer, you're not going to do the things. You're overcoming a mental hurdle that you've erected yourself. I think you need to just get past that and say, you know, okay, either I'm a writer or that's a label. Just okay, who cares? Like it's just like let's get to the job of writing. I think ultimately, the more you ask the question, the less you're actually writing, and so then that becomes part of it. But the whole topic of how we label ourselves things, I think, I brought up, in a previous conversation, the idea of people who drink, a lot and have a problem with alcohol, or people who, do drugs to a point where they say, like I have a problem with, I'm a drug addict, right? And they label themselves like that. They can be multiple things, right? You can be a homeowner, you could be a father, you could be a lot of things, right? And so we tend to pick certain things and give them more weight, and we say that those things are somehow, different, like what our job is, right? Like, we identify as what we do for a living. And I think that is I think a big part of this. I think again, it's an issue of access. It's an issue of, who controls, whether or not you are a writer. I think that we don't often think of ourselves as being the person that controls that. We have to get published or somebody has to read our work before we can say now, it's been verified by the general public or by, a publishing house. And so therefore I am a writer. But I think the same people who have that in their heads, I don't think they really know what the criteria is. So they're never going to get to a point where they get that validation because I don't think they've usually clearly identified what they're looking for as the source of validation.
right.
What's the point where you can say I'm a writer or I'm not? It's not going to be one line that you cross. I think it's habitual writing, however that is to you, like when you do it. I would have said before I was a musician. I played music my whole life. When I was in high school, I was in a band. We played, a Fireside Bowl in Chicago, like, probably every other weekend, and like at that point, music was the main thing in my life. And I would say, I'm a drummer, I'm a musician, and I would identify like that. Not anymore, because I just do it very casually, And so for me, it's more of a I don't aspire to be a musician. That's not a label that I covet, so I don't even care. Like I play guitar as a hobby to, when my wife is taking a shower and I'm watching my daughter, I'll pick up the guitar and that's when I, usually start playing a little bit.
So here's something that's interesting. You talked a little bit earlier about like being able to have multiple labels, right? That
Yeah.
you can be more than one thing. So I don't think you necessarily would even have to let go of I'm a musician. If let's imagine a scenario where there's a situation you always hear like, oh, is there a doctor in the house, like, so
Mhm.
imagine a situation where there's like some kind of crazy emergency and you're in a group of 100 people and they say, oh my god, is there a musician here, like,
Like a writing emergency. Like we need somebody to
right, but my point is that like if you were in that situation and they said, oh my god, is there a musician here, you would volunteer yourself. You'd say, yeah, I can play drums, I can play guitar, I can, I'm a
yeah,
musician, even though it might not be your primary thing that you identify as, you know, um, you can, depending on the context of the situation, you're still a musician. You're also a writer, you're also a dad, you're also, you
right.
know, a technician that understands technical things for writing, and I'm the same way. You know, if I was in a situation where they were like, oh my God, like, you know, for whatever reason, you know, we need someone that knows how to set up, you know, a projector, or set up, you know, a big show. You know, I'd step forward and say, well, I do that. I know how to do that. I'm a producer. And but if you just we were at a party and they said, what are, you know, what do you do? I'm not like, you don't list off everything you do, right? You don't
Right.
sit there. If
Right.
someone says, what do? You don't say, well, in the morning I get up and I cook breakfast, and then I like, you know what they're asking, and so you're giving them the answer they're looking for. And I think that that is where the problem comes in with being a writer, is that it's that if I'm at a party thing, and if I meet a stranger and they say, what do you do? And you say, I'm a writer, you feel like they're going to have in their mind a checklist of things that qualifies you to say that.
Right.
And it's not your qualifications, it's their qualifications. And
Right.
so, and nobody knows what that, you know, for someone, they could, you know, maybe you're a journalist and you write for, you know, the Chicago Tribune, and you
Right.
say, well, I'm a writer. That's what I do. I write newspaper articles. They're published in the newspaper every day, and I'm a writer. But the person across the table might say, well, but have you written a novel? Oh,
Mhm.
so you're just a reporter. You're not a writer. Whereas someone else might, you know, if you write novels and or short stories, and you go to a party in LA and you say, I'm a writer, and they go, oh, what shows have I seen? Oh no, I don't write shows. I
Right.
write books. And they're like, oh, you're a novelist, you're not a writer.
Right. And going
And
back to your other point about like people in LA, I mean, they might, that might also be a signal geographically, you know, for I'm in the business of writing, or I'm
mhm,
aspiring to be, or I'm in the market for writing. You know, like it might be an indication of your niche in that trade. You know, like what do you want to get into? What's your path that you're on? You know, so I think, you know, if we put aside the question of what it means to be a writer, because I think we kind of got to some common ground there, where it's like, you know, an issue of identification, and you know who has the who you're looking for to kind of make that judgment. You know, is it internal, is it external, is it, you know, something that you do, you know, daily versus a goal that you achieve. You know, like I think to a large degree that really is going to be something that an individual has to overcome in their own head. You know, like, am I a writer, am I not a writer, does it matter? Because, you know, that's ultimately, I think, what's going to, you know, when you think you're a writer, whatever that means to you. You know, if you're a reporter, first of all, I would disagree with that person at the party who says, oh, you're a reporter, you're not a writer. I'd be right there being like, that what is it? What do you mean by that? But what about what it means, like from like a, not maybe like a skill point, but like what qualities do writers have? So if I wanted to pursue writing, you know, if I maybe like had a 10-year-old, you know, saying, I want to write when I grow up, like what would they do to get into that path? So I put down a few things that I was thinking about when I kind of moved to that next level. And so the language, you know, love of language and language rules. So where do you think that plays in? As a writer yourself, you know, how do you like love grammar? Do you love certain mechanisms of writing, or you know, where do you stand on that? Is that something essential for somebody to be a writer?
yeah, I think I think the first thing, if you know you've got a 10-year-old asking, you know, what can I do to be a writer, the first two things are read, read a
Mhm.
lot,
Yep.
and read a lot of different things,
Mhm.
and then write. And it doesn't matter what you write, just write something. Write a journal, write a short story, write a poem, write a book report on what you just read. Just get used to putting words together and sliding them together, and making them communicate an idea. And then in terms of what you were actually asking about, like grammar and stuff, I think that I don't think that loving grammar and loving punctuation and rules and stuff like that is a prerequisite to be a writer, but I think that it comes naturally when you
Mhm.
start getting into that. So the more you read, the more you write, the more you play with language and play with the ideas of storytelling and play with those things, you start to automatically develop an affection, an affinity, and a love for the rules. Now, do writers follow those rules? Mm, in the beginning,
Mhm.
or maybe not in the beginning, in the middle, right? Because in the beginning, when you're starting to write, you don't even really know all the rules, and you are learning those rules as you go, and you start learning that those rules are there for a reason, right? We have specific punctuation marks to communicate different things. Commas and semicolons communicate two different things. A comma and a period communicate two different things. Apostrophes being used for pluralization versus being used for possession, and all of those things, you start learning that in order to communicate clearly what's in your head and the story that you're trying to tell, you need to have these rules in order for the other person to understand what you're saying. And that's when you're in the middle, is when you're like, you've developed this love of punctuation and grammar, and you think these rules are amazing. And that's the point where most people become like a bit of a pedant, and they're
Mhm.
like, oh, the grammar Nazi, the grammar police, I'm going to correct everyone's grammar and correct everyone, punctuation, because I think, grammar and punctuation is important. But as you move on from that and you become more advanced, that's when you start breaking the rules. And you don't just break the rules willy-nilly, you break the rules very specifically and on purpose, because you are telling your audience knows what the rule is and what it's supposed to imply. And by intentionally breaking that rule, you're communicating something to them. You're saying, I'm I stumbling for an example here, but you're saying, like, for me, I use commas a lot more than the rules say, and I get
Mhm.
called out for it by grammar police and people who are very into grammar. And my point is that, yes, I know I'm breaking a rule here. I know, like, that there shouldn't be a comma here, or there should be a comma here, but I'm putting it there because I want you to understand that the person speaking stopped.
Mhm.
And or I am a huge, like, obsessive fan of the semicolon. Okay, a
Yeah.
semicolon is supposed to separate a sentence into two related ideas that aren't
Right.
the
It
the same thing.
it fixes a comma splice,
Right,
essentially.
right. But it also implies a much, like, heavier pause,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
So it implies a a pause in an idea that is weighted and suggests that the person communicating is is either grappling with an idea, or is, like, giving you a bigger, like, delivery at the end. So I will use them in places where they aren't necessarily grammatically correct, but I know that my reader sees it and is going to feel the the impact of that piece of punctuation. And so, yeah, I think that just developing a love of reading and writing inherently develops a love of the rules of language,
Mhm.
because that's what reading and writing is. It's communicating ideas across space.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what you just said. There's a great quote from Harold Bloom, who I'm not a huge fan of philosophically, but he does have some good stuff out there. But he said of James Joyce, that he was talking about his use of language, and kind of what you're saying about how, like, the beginning and the middle of the end of the writing career, is different. And he has this quote that I'm gonna just paraphrase because I can't remember exactly what it was, but he said, that James Joyce followed all the rules at the beginning before he launched his assault on the English language, and then he gets like Finnegan's Wake, where it's like, he uses words like that, they're portmanteaus of like two different words that he's making up. And it's, but I also, I'm a fan of grammar, you know, of learning the rules because I have like kind of a math background. That's kind of my basis. I think has always been in like kind of math and science. And so when I write, I like those rules because I kind of what you're saying with the semicolon, to me, that's the same as like an equation, like I have a degree in physics and you're always manipulating things and trying to find like a different route or a faster route to solve things. And I would always see something, like that a person would do, and I'd be interested in how they got that result and the steps that they followed. And I liked reverse engineering solutions from textbooks, because I liked that process of unwinding it. And I think that grammar has that same fun to me, where I can think about what a sentence might mean, based on the punctuation. I know the movie, Woody Allen movie, What's Up, Tiger Lily, when my so it's a movie. I don't know if the listeners haven't seen it, but it's a movie where it's overdubbed. It's an old, like, I believe it's a Chinese movie, black and white, and then it's been overdubbed to make it a completely different movie. And the whole thing is that there is no comma in the title, so it's not "What's up, comma Tiger Lily," like "Hey Tiger Lily, what's going on?" It's just the
What's
phrase "What's up, Tiger Lily," right? And when my dad pointed that out to me when I was maybe like 15, I was blown away by the fact that there wasn't a comma there and how it changed the meaning of it, and then grossed out by the fact that my dad just told me that. And I was like, oh my God.
what's up, Tiger Lily? Like, there's a meme, there's a million of them, but the meme that goes all over the internet that says punctuation saves lives, and it's the difference between "let's eat, grandma" and
Right.
"let's eat, grandma."
Yep.
Like,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Eats, Shoots, and Leaves is a book I own but haven't read, but I think it's a lot about that kind of stuff where, there's pandas on the cover and they're talking
yeah.
about, if you put commas in the right place, then it's no, a panda will eat, shoots, and leaves. But if you don't, then or if you do rather, then it becomes, I eat, then I shoot, then I
Shoot, then
leave.
leave. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about, I think, moving to kind of another prerequisite for writers, and I kind of want to know what your thoughts on this are. Reading your own work. How do you feel about reading your own work?
Sometimes I really like it and sometimes I don't. I'll go back and read really old stuff and just be like, oh, like, how I have the first story I ever completely finished for my own self was, I was in high school. I think it was my junior year, and I finished a story called, it was a screenplay I was writing at the time called The Fifth Floor, and it was kind of a well, you know how whenever anytime you start writing, you like, when you're in your early stages, you're kind of ripping off the people that you read.
Yeah.
You're kind of
Emulating.
emulating, copying,
Yeah.
and so it was kind of a Twilight Zone-ish, Outer Limits kind of story, but it was also very, very Quentin Tarantino. Like, I was
Mhm.
so obsessed with Quentin Tarantino, and so everything I wrote sounded like a Quentin Tarantino movie. And I look back on it, and the story is still good, but when I go back and read it, it's terrible. But I'll go back and reread Dark White, not the whole thing, but I'll go back and read a passage here and there. And for a while, I was doing a podcast. I still would like to continue that and finish it, where I was doing like a DVD commentary track for the
Mhm.
book. So I would read a scene. I do a chapter per episode or so, and I would read a scene and then take a break and talk about that scene and the writing process of that scene and what came across it. And for the most part, it's kind of fun to go back and reread something. You have to have space. By the time you finish a book and you publish it, you're kind of sick of it.
Mhm.
You've been and honestly, and the other thing is that now, like, if someone was to quiz me on Dark White, I would probably fail that test because I forget a lot, and I also get different drafts of it mixed up in my head. So I'll be like, well, what about the scene where this happens? Oh, I don't
Yeah.
remember that in the book. And it's like, no, really, it's like this happened, that's not in the book. And it's like, oh, right, that got cut at some point or another, and it's not in there. But in my head,
Yeah.
it's still in there. But my favorite thing, and I every once in a while on TikTok, I'll do this, is I'll do a video where I'm like, things I forgot I wrote. And I will find a line or a passage from something I've written that I forgot I wrote and that I'm impressed with. And I'll be like, my God, I I can't believe I wrote that, and I forgot I
Yeah.
wrote that, and it makes me happy to read that, because it'll send chills down my spine. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on the scenario. I'm not bothered by reading my own writing the way some people are, but and then sometimes I get a lot of enjoyment out of it. What about you? Do you reread old stuff?
Oh yeah. I go on kind of like excavations, and I'll read. I think it partly has to do with the way I organize things, but I use Scrivener, and I have my novels will be their own Scrivener like file, right? But my short stories are all in one. So like, I have a single
Oh,
file. Yeah. And when I'll go back, and some will be like as small as paragraph or two, and then other ones will be full-fledged ones. And so sometimes when I open it up to write, and maybe this is a bad habit, but I'll open up to write and I'll be like, oh, let me read that one. And it becomes a time wasting thing. But kind of like you're saying, I think when I look back on it, I'll have like those two mixed reactions. Sometimes I'll be like, oh God, like what was I doing there? And other times I'll look back and I'll be like, oh man, that was really good. Like I should probably reincorporate that, or sometimes it just makes me feel like I'm on the right path, like it's some reaffirmation that, you know, because like you said, you get some distance from it and it almost becomes like someone else's work. You look back and you're like, this is, kind of unfamiliar to me. So you're almost looking at it with fresh eyes. And if you can do that and be impressed by it, then it's worth keeping, I think. If you can do it and it stands out as kind of awkward and ugly to you, then I think to get rid of it, or scrap it. But I don't I wouldn't say get rid of it, but it's all valuable. I mean, I think that self editing eye is really important. I always tell the people that I work with, because I do a lot of editing for them, it's impossible to edit your own work, like because of that familiarization that you have with it. So like, you hear phrases and you see things in your own writing, and you might connect those two, but somebody else, they won't maybe make that connection that like that you make, because with like an idiomatic phrase, or some kind of the structure of a sentence that you might hear or you might say, like you've grown up with, someone else from a different background might be like, that doesn't translate well into reading, right? But to you, you're so familiar with it.
plus,
I do. Yeah.
if you have like if you're writing a story, you have your characters' backgrounds and backstory and all that kind of in your head, and sometimes you don't always realize or remember what you've included in the written
Yep.
word on the page, and so you reference something that makes no sense because it's there in your
Yep.
head, and you don't even realize that you've never told the reader that. And so that's why, even on rereading it, you'll be, because when I write, like if I finish a first draft of a book, I walk away from it for like 3 months before I go
Mhm.
back to edit it, because I need to forget it, because otherwise it's so fresh that you're not even really rereading it, you're just retelling
Yes.
yourself the story in your head. But even then, when you go back 3 months later, you still have all the backstories of those characters in your head, and you won't necessarily catch something you've forgotten to share. And that's why having, whether you're hiring a professional editor whose job is to edit, or you just have like a whole bunch of beta readers that read things and tell you what they didn't understand and what mistakes you made and caught that. I don't necessarily think having a professional editor is an absolute requirement for writing and publishing stories, but I do think that sharing it with people before you share it widely is important, because you need other
Mhm.
people's eyes on that.
Right, right. So like beta readers, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think they fulfill that same function. Just I've heard. I don't know if this is true, and I should. So there's totally a rumor, but George R. R. Martin, I've heard, hires people. He has his own like group of people to keep like track of storylines and story elements for that very reason. He has so much going on in so many different, families and history and all these things, that he essentially hires his own fact checkers just to basically say, nope, you took that out. That's not in there anymore. And I think that, yeah, as a writer, you either have to take really, really good notes, so that you remember what you've taken out and, all that. And I think that gets in the way of writing for me. So having somebody else look definitely exposes those assumptions that you've made, that you've clearly articulated something or, explained it.
Yeah, and
Um,
keeping notes kind of goes into the subject of like being an outliner, being a plotter versus a pantser or a non-plotter. And that can be another episode entirely. But
mhm.
yeah, it's definitely part of that whole process of when you're discovering, when you've decided to call yourself a writer and you say, okay, this is what I'm going to self-identify as. There are then levels below that of what kind of writer am I and how do I write and how do I, you know, I was, what was I listening to? It was, I think it was Cortex, which is Mike Hurley and CGB Grey, which is a great podcast. But he was, God, maybe it wasn't. I think it was though. And they were basically talking about the idea that when you start doing something, no, you know what? It was Adam Savage. When you start doing something, you don't know what you're doing. And so you're very cognizant of the fact that you don't know what you're doing. And so you are following rules, you're learning rules, you're taking direction from other people, you are, but the thing that you're doing is like an other thing, and you're
Mm,
trying to come at it. And then at some point you shift and and you that thing becomes kind of part of you and you become part of it, and you start having a point of view on the thing, and you
mm.
start having your own perceptions and your own feelings about how it should be done and what are the best ways of doing it. And so um and then that's that kind of point of where you start breaking rules, or you start adjusting rules, or you start making your own decisions, because you've got a point of view on being a musician or being a writer or being or whatever. and and you can kind of start adding yourself to the process. And I think that that is an important step in, being a writer, is getting to that point where you have a point of view on how stories should be told, and making them your own.
So what about, we go back to that idea, this 10-year-old kid or 25-year-old college grad or 50-year-old who's always wanted to be a writer, is looking to get more involved in it and define themselves in this way. What about writing groups? How do you think that they fit in? Do you think that they are beneficial to somebody in terms of coming to like some kind of a definition of being a writer themselves? Do you think they're harmful? Do
I
you
think they
think
can be.
yeah.
I think, I mean, I like a writers group, and I like a good writers group. I have always wanted to write something with like a partner. Like, you see this in
Mhm.
Hollywood a lot, like, screenplays or TV shows or something are created by a writing pair, and I've always thought that that would be a really enjoyable thing, is to like, for like 8 months, lock yourself in a room every day with someone, and like the two of you hammer out a story together. I think that that's a really fun notion. And I think a writers group where you come in and you share your work, and you either share what your like current work in progress is, or you just do a prompt based writers group. I think that they can be very helpful. I think that the danger becomes, a lot of writers groups that I've been involved with become this thing where it's like self-esteem builder or something like that, where there's no criticism or critique. It's just
Mhm.
like, oh my God, you're so talented, oh my God, and there's no depth to the conversation at all.
Yep.
If I take stuff into a writers group, if there's something that in the story I share that is amazing and really resonates, I'd love to hear that, because that's important. But I would rather have like all the critique be hard criticism of stuff that isn't working or that they don't understand, because
Mhm.
that's the stuff that allows me to see where I'm struggling and fix it. And that's the stuff that improves me as a writer. So I think finding a writers group that is, I mean, it doesn't have to be masochistic, right? You don't have to be like, I just want abuse. But if you can find a writers group that is going to be really honest and everyone that's there is there to help each other become better writers and not just to feel good about their writing, but to become better, then I
Mhm.
think a writers group can be really, really valuable. But if it's just a bunch of people patting each other on the back, I don't think that's helpful. I started over the summer a writers group on TikTok where I do a live every Sunday at 7 p.m. Central. And I put a prompt up. And this is something I got from you, Ben, in a writers group that we had a while back, because every writers group I'd been to before that was all about like share your work in progress and we'll critique it,
Mhm.
we'll take it apart. And then you came up with the idea of like, well, let's do a prompt-based writers group that isn't about what we're working on, but it's just about like working on craft. And I thought that was brilliant. And so when I started this writers group on TikTok, I decided that that's what I would do. So I put prompts up. I do a video throughout the week that has like the prompt on it. And then I also have the prompts on my website. And people can go and they can take the prompt and they can write 2,000 words and submit it through the website. And then everything that I get from everyone in a week gets read. So I go live and I read the prompt that was for the week, and then I read every story that was submitted. And then after each story, we'll take some time in the comment, people will be talking about it in the comments on the video, and I'll be talking about like, and it's not about bashing it. It's about saying, okay, this really worked and I really like this. And this is what I think is great. But here's like, what are we doing with this? Is this going to be published as a short story? Okay, in that
Mhm.
case, we need to get to the point faster. Is this going to be expanded into a novel? Great. Then I need more information about this character. I need to know more about their relationship. I need to know what their motivations are. And so we'll talk about what works, and then we'll talk about what doesn't work and what isn't necessarily bad, but just needs to be fixed or tweaked, or and that in that sense it's a craft workshop. We're talking about the craft of writing, and we're talking about how we go about communicating ideas. So yeah, I think that that's where it becomes valuable. I know you've been in a lot of writers groups. What are your points of view?
I have learned a ton from writers groups. I was actually just thinking about this the other day. I've learned a lot about, I think, just the mechanics of writing beyond, like the art of storytelling, which I would actually say is my weakness, oddly enough. Like, I mean, like telling a story that goes somewhere is hard for me, but writing about something artfully seems to be okay. Like, so I can, maybe I should be a poet instead, but I can't stand poetry. So I think writing groups, though, my big problem with them is that, well, I have a couple, but one is the artificial length. Somebody will say 2,000 words on, from a novel you're working on, or, whatever. And I'm like, okay, fine. And you submit that. What's the best information that you can get from that? And if it's going to take you, you know, 300 pages to make your point, to tell your story, what's somebody going to get out of 2,000 words that is going to really reflect what you're trying to achieve? So I think that that's one of my issues with kind of being in groups that, set those kind of limits arbitrarily. I think the other thing is that some people honestly just don't know what the hell they're talking about, and they're giving you feedback. That I was in a writing group with a woman who went overboard with trying to get you to show don't tell, to the point where, like, I was like, this is no, I'm not going to do that. No, like, she would be like, well, how did the rain smell, and how did it feel, and what was in your pocket? And, like, and she goes into all this stuff. And I'm like, I could have said all those things. I didn't, because those are not important details. Like, if I go into, like, yeah, maybe if I mention what's in somebody's pocket, it gives it a sense of realism, that, it increases, the reader's experience. But is that important? Like, is that nickel or that wad of paper that they have, or that receipt that they forgot to throw away from 2 days ago, is that important to the story? And it might be, maybe the fact that they have a receipt from 2 days ago shows me that they haven't changed their jeans and that they're a normal human being who goes a couple days without washing their jeans, before, it's like, I don't know. Like, I mean, I think that so many people spend time, I kind of the opposite of what you were saying. Like, I think so many people spend this time looking for problems that they just come up with stuff, and they will just lay crap on you and just be like, well, I don't know what else to say, so maybe try doing this, or maybe try doing this. And it's like, well, and then you're like, I'm going to in 3 chapters. Like, this
Yeah.
is something that will come out. But I also, like, I feel like, and this is something we can actually talk about maybe on another time. But we were in a writing group together where I feel like the person running it was just arbitrary and kind of, unstable. And so I feel like the criticism that came
I
from
know
that,
what you're talking about.
yeah, the criticism that came from that, I think, was like, untrustworthy, because I was like, wait, like, one week it would be like, this is, I have to be honest, I don't like where this is going. And then I'd be like, oh, okay. And then the next week I'd write something else, and that same person would say, whoa, well, this is not up to the level that we've come to expect from you. Last week's was so, gripping and engaging. And I'd be like, what you just trashed it last week. What are you talking about? And it was like, you are just talking to talk. You want to be thought of as this, this reservoir of knowledge, and this kind of writing guru, and you're just in the same boat as the rest of us. You're just,
Yeah.
and so that's my issue, is you get kind of like crappy feedback and mixed feedback from people who are not well informed or qualified to give that feedback all the time.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean it's not fair. And I do think that there's some value to hearing criticism and not getting emotional about it.
Yes.
Hearing criticism and being able to weigh it objectively and say, either I agree with that or I don't agree with that. You know,
And that's something I think that writers and artists in general, in anything that you're putting yourself out there, has to train themselves to do is, first of all, to not take things personally. I mean, Jesus, poor actors. I mean, as bad
Mhm.
as it is for writers, actors have it so much worse when they have to go to audition after audition after audition and be like shot down and told that they're not good enough.
Because of, like, trivial things, like the way you look. Like, oh,
Yeah.
you have like, my friend Megan, she went into modeling really briefly after high school, and she told me about one experience that kind of killed it for her. She went in this line, and they were like, literally, there was a bunch of people that looked like her, and they were just going, no, 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 no. Okay, we're gonna take that one. Everyone else leave. And it was like, she just felt like crap, because she was like, I just felt not pretty. I felt like whatever. And I'm like, they were looking for a really specific thing,
Yeah.
and that person's nose was a centimeter
Yeah.
narrower than yours or something.
Their
Like,
eyebrows like went up instead of
yeah,
like it's like, yeah, and you
yeah,
can't. And so that I feel, yeah, modeling and acting and stuff, but anytime you're putting yourself out there, you have to learn to be able to take criticism and not take it personally. And then you
right.
also, as you said, have to learn how to not take all of it. So if
Mhm.
something comes at you and it hits you and you go, oh, you're right, yeah, I see that, I need to fix that, versus someone coming and saying something and you go, yeah, you just don't get it. And like,
Right.
and I get criticism like that all the time where I'm like, yeah, never, like I'm just going to ignore that. Like that
Right.
piece of criticism is not useful to me. So I forget about it. And when I'm giving criticism, especially on the TikTok writers group, that I try to be very clear, especially when I'm being harsher. And there's some members that have been on longer and that have submitted more, that are just more like used to it. And I know I can be a little harsher with them. And then others that are, newer, and I don't want to discourage them. And so it's, you try to be, more complimentary and less harsh. But even when I'm being my harshest, I'm like, look, this advice is based solely on what I'm seeing here and now. And if this is going to be expanded, then maybe you don't need to take this advice right now. Maybe it comes in
Mhm.
later. And if
Yep.
you're, and so just understand that this is not a slam of your writing. It's just what I feel like in the context of the box that I'm looking at right now is working in this box, and what is
Mhm.
not like what is unclear or not working in this box. And I think
Yeah.
that, learning how to give a critique is as important. And frankly, I find I learn as much about craft by critiquing other people's writing as I do about getting
Yes.
critiqued. So I'll look at a piece of writing and I'll say, oh, this isn't working. And then I'll say, well, why isn't it working? And I'll have to reread it or something. And then once I figure out what's wrong, what's not working, what they need to do to fix that, then I can like internalize that, so that when I'm writing, I don't fall into the same trap, and I can go, oh yeah, remember you noticed
Hmm.
this doesn't work when you do this, and so don't do it yourself.
Yeah. So that is loaded with good advice and good insight. I remember, so I got a couple things to say about that, but like the first one is exposition in dialogue was the first thing that I kind of learned. For me, I was like, what does dialogue, like what makes dialogue realistic and what makes it unrealistic for me was when people would try to include backstory and they'd be like, oh, well, you have a meeting at such and such business place tomorrow at 5 a.m. What do you mean you're not, and it's like, why would that person tell that person that? Like, why would
Yeah,
they explain? They know that. They're aware
yeah,
that all you have to do is say you have a meeting tomorrow. What are you
right.
doing? And they try to get all this information across in dialogue, and it makes it sound really stiff and whatever. But the thing that I think is really big, and I think it actually applies to a lot of what anyone does if they want to become skilled at it, and I think they say this in the medical field, is see it once, do it once, teach it once. And and you're absolutely right. Once you've gone into teaching mode, you have a different analytical eye, like kind of a critical eye on things that is essential for your own work. And I think it just solidifies it. And honestly, part of the reason I wanted to do the podcast is because of that, because
Yeah,
talking about this stuff, it brings up other things that I'm like, oh yeah, I read that one time, or I saw that one time, and I heard that, and so it's in a way for me, it reinforces things, and it kind of brings me to a kind of an external view of stuff. So I totally agree with that.
yeah, and I hope that that's what the people that listen to this can get out of it too. Is, you know one of the nice things about podcasts is I feel like people who listen to podcasts frequently, you kind of start feeling like you're a part of that conversation.
Yep.
And so by doing that, you internalize things, and you look at things differently, and you get more out of it than just reading a book that is telling you about craft. And so, as we kind of wrap up here on time today, I think that that's what we're hoping that this podcast can provide. We're gonna, continue to talk about craft things and what it means to be a writer broadly is kind of what this whole thing is about. But as we dive into some of the other topics we have, and I was thinking, next week we could do your plot versus plotless stories topic, and kind of, I think that's a good place to go from here, because we're kind of getting into that notion of storytelling. But yeah, that's what I hope everyone can get out of it, is just feeling like they're finding out things about themselves and how they want to tell stories.
Right. And I think that doing you know I actually had written out to talk, as an additional topic about books, which I think again is another thing for later. But like the idea of like, how much information can you get from books about writing, and are they valuable, or are they just a distraction, and how many should you read, because there's millions out there. So it's like, and I think it all comes down to like, if this is something that you love and you want to read those books, and that inspires you and that makes you excited about it, if you want to do a podcast about writing, if that inspires you and that makes you excited about it, I think if you love something, you start to want to explore it from multiple different angles, and look at all the different elements, going back to our grammar conversation, learning the rules about it, and you immerse yourself in it. And I think that, for me, big takeaway, that's what it is. I think you become a writer when you want to immerse yourself in it, and you are so entwined with just the world of reading and writing and literature, that it, it's not an issue of definition anymore. It's just
It's
what you do.
it's what you feel. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that that's what it comes down to. Do you feel like you're a writer? Then you're a writer. That's
Yep.
all it has to. That's as simple as it has to be. What do you feel? Do you feel like you're a writer? Then you're a
Right.
writer.
And that's the only criteria on which you can base it reliably. I can't control what somebody else's definition of a writer is. I can't I can't live up to unknown expectations that somebody might have of what a writer is, like, do I look the part? Do I write things they like? I mean, if that's the criteria, then, I could say that, I don't know, who's a writer I don't like. Maybe I shouldn't name somebody, but I mean, like, you read something and you put it down, and it's like, does that make them not a writer because I didn't like it? No. I mean, they're still a writer. So I mean, your definition is the one that counts, and that's what makes you a writer. So that's
Great.
that's my 2 cents.
Well, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. All right, well, we'll
Cool.
we'll chat and then we'll meet up again next Saturday.
Next Saturday. See you then.
All right, man. Bye.
Bye.